Racist teacher spills boiling coffee on black girl's afro. Her father is watching a teacher's careless behavior leads to an unforgettable confrontation when the girl's father decides it's time to act. And if you cherish your family and love stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and avoid 10 years of bad luck. The hallways of Jefferson High School buzzed with typical morning activity. Students shuffled between lockers, trading weekend stories and last-minute homework answers. The fluorescent lights cast their usual sterile glow across the institutional beige walls, while teachers clutched their coffee cups, moving purposefully toward their classrooms. Maya Williams stood at her locker, carefully arranging her presentation materials. At 15, she carried herself with quiet confidence, her natural hair styled in neat, intricate braids that had taken hours to perfect the night before. Her project on cultural diversity sat organized in a blue folder, complete with photographs, statistics, and personal accounts she'd gathered from her community. This wasn't just another school presentation for Maya. It represented weeks of research and a chance to educate her classmates about the importance of embracing different cultural backgrounds. Room 207 filled gradually as the bell approached. Students claimed their usual seats, some still drowsy from the early hour. Ms. Linda Thompson moved between the rows, balancing a steaming cup of coffee while checking attendance on her tablet. Her heels clicked against the linoleum floor, a sound that had become synonymous with her presence in the classroom. She'd been teaching at Jefferson for 15 years, and her reputation for strict adherence to rules preceded her. James Williams, Maya's father, entered the classroom quietly, taking a seat in the back. As a prominent community activist, his presence commanded attention, though he tried to remain unobtrusive for his daughter's sake. Several parents had come to observe the presentations, but James's involvement in local civil rights initiatives made him particularly recognizable. He nodded politely to other parents while keeping his eyes focused on Maya, who was preparing to present. The atmosphere shifted dramatically in an instant. Ms. Thompson, attempting to maneuver between the tight rows of desks, lost her balance. The coffee cup tilted, its contents arcing through the air in slow motion. Several students gasped as the hot liquid splashed directly onto Maya's carefully styled hair, dripping down onto her white blouse. The scalding coffee caused Maya to jerk backward, knocking her presentation materials to the floor. The classroom erupted in chaos. Students pushed back their chairs, some standing to get a better view, others frozen in shock. The coffee continued to drip, creating dark stains on Maya's clothes and destroying hours of careful hair preparation. Ms. Thompson stood paralyzed, empty cup still in hand, her face a mask of horror at what had just transpired. James rose from his seat, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. The room fell silent as he moved forward, his expression tight with controlled anger. Years of dealing with systemic injustice had taught him to measure his responses carefully, but the sight of his daughter, humiliated and in pain, tested his restraint. What exactly happened here? His voice cut through the silence, deep and measured but trembling with barely contained emotion. Ms. Thompson stammered, clutching her empty cup like a shield. Other parents in the room shifted uncomfortably, recognizing the powder keg moment unfolding before them. Maya remained rooted to her spot, coffee dripping from her hair, her carefully prepared presentation scattered across the floor. Tears welled in her eyes, but she fought them back, unwilling to add crying to her humiliation. The project she'd worked so hard on lay in disarray at her feet, some pages stained with coffee, others crumpled under panicked students' feet. The tension in the room became palpable as James stepped closer to Ms. Thompson's desk. Other students began recording with their phones, sensing the gravity of the moment. The morning's normal academic atmosphere had transformed into something else entirely, a confrontation that would soon cascade beyond the walls of room 207. "I want an explanation," James continued, his voice gaining strength. "Not just about the coffee, but about why my daughter was positioned where a teacher would be carrying hot liquids near her in the first place." His words carried the weight of years of similar incidents, both witnessed and experienced, transforming this accident into something far more significant. Sarah Martinez, Maya's closest friend since middle school, immediately sprang into action. She grabbed Maya's arm and guided her toward the door, navigating through the maze of desks and staring students. Maya's shoulders shook with suppressed sobs as they hurried down the hallway toward the nearest bathroom, leaving a trail of coffee drops on the linoleum floor. The girls' bathroom offered little comfort with its harsh lighting and cold tile walls, but at least it provided privacy from the prying eyes of their classmates. Sarah grabbed paper towels, wetting them with cool water while Maya stood over the sink, watching coffee drip from her ruined hair into the white porcelain basin. "It'll be okay," Sarah said, though her voice carried uncertainty. She began dabbing at Maya's scalp, checking for burns. "We can fix this. My mom's a hairstylist, remember? She can help." Back in room 207, the situation had escalated. James Williams stood his ground, his presence commanding attention as other parents who had been observing the presentations began to approach. Mrs. Rodriguez, whose son had faced similar discrimination the previous semester, stepped forward first. "This isn't an isolated incident," she declared, her accent thickening with emotion. "Last term, my Carlos was told his Spanish presentation needed to be in proper English or he'd fail. We've been quiet too long." Another parent, Mr. Chun, joined the growing circle. "My daughter was mocked for bringing traditional lunch. The teacher did nothing." Each new voice added layers to what had started as a simple accident, revealing a pattern that could no longer be ignored. Miss Thompson had retreated behind her desk, her face pale. "I assure you, this was purely accidental. I would never intentionally dash." But her words were cut off by more parents stepping forward, each with their own story to share. Principal Davidson arrived, summoned by a student who'd slipped out during the commotion. His usual authoritative demeanor seemed diminished as he surveyed the scene. James Williams, surrounded by supportive parents. Miss Thompson, backed against her desk. Students recording everything on their phones, and Maya's abandoned presentation materials still scattered across the floor. "Mr. Williams," Davidson began, adopting his most diplomatic tone, "let's discuss this in my office. We can handle this situation professionally and dash." "Professionally?" James's voice carried years of frustration. "Like how professionally my daughter was treated, or how professionally you've handled the complaints from other parents." He gestured to the growing group around him. Mrs. Rodriguez stepped closer to James. "We should call the others," she said quietly. "The Community Action Committee needs to hear about this." Several parents nodded in agreement, already pulling out their phones. Principal Davidson's attempt at damage control began to unravel as more parents voiced their support for James. The administrator's practice speeches about proper channels and procedure fell flat against the raw emotion in the room. Each attempt to minimize the incident only served to highlight the administration's disconnection from the real issues facing their divers. The student body. In the bathroom, Maya had finally given in to tears, while Sarah stood guard at the door, preventing curious students from entering. The cold paper towels provided little comfort against the hot shame and anger coursing through her. Her phone buzzed repeatedly with messages from classmates, but she couldn't bring herself to look at them. "Your dad's not going to let this go," Sarah said, trying to sound encouraging. "And you shouldn't either. Remember when you told me about your cousin in Atlanta? How her school changed after they stood up to discrimination?" Maya nodded slightly, wincing as Sarah tried to salvage what she could of her hairstyle. The incident had transformed from a painful accident into something larger, something that would force long-buried issues into the open. Through the bathroom walls, they could hear the growing commotion in the hallway as more parents arrived, drawn by urgent text messages from their children. Principal Davidson's voice echoed through the hallway, attempting to restore order, but the momentum had shifted. The morning's events had cracked the veneer of tolerance that the school had carefully maintained, revealing the deep-seated issues beneath. What started with spilled coffee was rapidly becoming a catalyst for long-overdue change. Maya sat on the closed toilet lid in the last stall, her phone clutched in trembling hands. Sarah leaned against the door outside, maintaining a protective barrier between her friend and the growing number of curious students trying to peek inside the bathroom. The notification sounds kept coming. Text messages, social media alerts, and missed calls accumulated on Maya's screen. "Everyone's talking about it," Sarah reported, scrolling through her own phone. "Someone posted a video. It's already got hundreds of shares." She hesitated before adding, People are on your side, Maya. They're calling out the school. Maya stared at her reflection in her phone's black screen. The carefully styled braids she'd spent hours perfecting with her mother now hung limp and stained. I can't go back in there, she whispered, her voice rough from crying. I can't face everyone looking at me, pitying me, or worse, recording everything for their social media. Sarah tried another approach. Your presentation was important, Maya. It was about exactly this kind of thing, about understanding and respect. Maybe this proves exactly why it matters. Down the hall, James Williams had positioned himself in the school's main office. His phone pressed to his ear as he spoke with Marcus Johnson, a prominent civil rights attorney who'd helped the community with previous discrimination cases. Around him, a small group of parents had gathered, their presence making the office staff visibly uncomfortable. No, Marcus, this isn't just about the coffee, James explained, his free hand gesturing emphatically. We're looking at years of incidents. Parents are coming forward. We need you here. He listened for a moment, then nodded. 2 hours? Good. Bring the documentation from the Thompson Middle School case. There's a pattern here. Social media exploded with activity as students shared their versions of events. The video of the incident spread rapidly across platforms, accompanied by passionate debates in the comments. Some defended Ms. Thompson, claiming it was clearly an accident, while others shared their own experiences of subtle discrimination at Jefferson High. Hashtag Justice for Maya started trending locally, then regionally. Former students began sharing their stories, creating a digital timeline of similar incidents that had gone unaddressed. The school's official social media accounts remained conspicuously silent, their last post about the upcoming football game now flooded with angry comments. Outside the main office, Reverend Keith Marshall, a local community leader and longtime ally of James's activism, arrived with several other community bears. Their presence transformed the school's atmosphere from tense to electric. Students watched through classroom windows as more cars pulled into the parking lot, recognizing parents and community figures they'd seen on local news. We need to document everything, Reverend Marshall advised, setting up an impromptu command center using the parent volunteer room. Every incident, every dismissive response from administration, every time they've swept these issues under the rug. It ends today. Parents began sharing their stories, while Reverend Marshall's assistant recorded everything on her laptop. Mrs. Rodriguez described how her son's Spanish-language achievements were consistently overlooked for school awards. Mr. Chen showed emails where his complaints about cultural insensitivity were dismissed as oversensitivity. Each news story reinforced the pattern of systemic issues within the school. Back in the bathroom, Sarah's phone lit up with a message from her mother, who worked at the local news station. They're sending reporters, she told Maya. Channel 5 and the Chronicle. Your dad's making sure this doesn't get buried like the last time. Maya remembered the last time, when her cousin's experience with discrimination at another school had been quietly resolved with empty promises of cultural sensitivity training. She stood up, legs shaky, but determination growing. What time is it? She asked Sarah. Almost 11. Why? Because my presentation was supposed to be about how our school needs to change, Maya said, moving to the sink to wash her face. Maybe this wasn't how I planned to deliver that message, but now everyone's listening. Outside, the hallways filled with whispered conversations and the occasional chant as students began organizing their own response to the morning's events. Class schedules were forgotten as the school transformed into an impromptu forum for long-suppressed discussions about race, respect, and responsibility. Principal Davidson's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing an emergency assembly for the following morning. The announcement was met with skepticism from students and staff alike, who recognized it as a desperate attempt to regain control of a situation that had already grown beyond the administration's ability to contain. James ended another call and looked at the growing crowd of supporters. The morning's horrible incident had cracked open a door that the school could no longer close. As he watched more community members arrive, he realized that Maya's ruined presentation might accomplish more than any carefully prepared speech could have. The school auditorium filled rapidly the next morning. Students, parents, teachers, and community members filed in, creating distinct groups that reflected the growing tensions. The administration had attempted to control attendance by requiring student IDs, but James Williams's quick call to the district superintendent had forced them to open the doors to all concerned community members. Principal Davidson stood at the podium, adjusting his tie repeatedly as he watched the crowd grow. The front rows, usually reserved for faculty, now held a mix of civil rights attorneys, local religious leaders, and community activists. Marcus Johnson, the civil rights attorney, sat with an open laptop, documenting everything. "We need a head count," Marcus instructed his assistant. "Every person matters. This isn't just a school meeting anymore. It's evidence." His fingers moved steadily across his keyboard, recording names, positions, and preliminary statements from attendees. The tension rose as Ms. Thompson entered through a side door, accompanied by a teachers' union representative. She took a seat near the back, but the ripple of whispers and turning heads marked her presence. Several students raised their phones to record, only lowering them when teachers intervened. James stood at the center of a group of parents AR the stage, reviewing notes with Reverend Marshall and Mrs. Rodriguez. They had spent the night compiling incidents, testimonies, and documentation of previous complaints that had gone unaddressed. The manila folders in their hands represented years of systematic dismissal of minority students' concerns. Maya sat with Sarah in the middle section, surrounded by supportive classmates. Her hair had been restyled by Sarah's mother late the previous night, but the emotional wounds remained fresh. Other students kept approaching to share their own stories of discrimination, each one strengthening her resolve. Principal Davidson cleared his throat into the microphone. "We've called this meeting to address yesterday's unfortunate incident and to open a dialogue about moving forward as a united school community." His practiced words fell flat against the charged atmosphere. James stepped forward before Davidson could continue. "With respect, Principal Davidson, we're not here to discuss a single incident. We're here to address a pattern." He moved to the center aisle, his voice carrying clearly without the microphone. "I have documentation of 37 formal complaints filed by parents of minority students in the past 2 years alone. 37 complaints that were dismissed, ignored, or lost in administrative processing." The audience stirred. Davidson's face reddened as James approached the stage, manila folders in hand. "These aren't just papers," James continued. "These are our children's stories, our community's pain, and we're not leaving until every single one is acknowledged and addressed." For the next hour, parents and students took turns at the microphone. A sophomore described being told her natural hair violated dress code. A junior shared how his request for a Muslim prayer space was repeatedly denied. A senior revealed how college recommendation letters subtly differed between white students and students of color. Ms. Thompson's union representative attempted to frame the coffee incident as an unfortunate accident, but her words were drowned out by more stories. Each new testimony built upon the last, creating a devastating picture of institutional bias. Marcus Johnson stood, his legal pad filled with notes. "What we're seeing here isn't just a collection of isolated incidents. It's a pattern of systematic discrimination that violates multiple civil rights statutes." His words sent Davidson and the other administrators into hurried whispers. The meeting reached its climax when James took the podium again. "My daughter came to school yesterday ready to present a project about diversity. Instead, she became an unwilling example of why that presentation was necessary." His voice filled the auditorium, carrying years of frustrated activism and paternal protection. "We're not asking for apologies," he continued. "We're demanding change. Real change. Measurable change. The kind of change that means no other student has to sit in a bathroom crying because the system failed them." The impact was immediate and visible. Several board members present at the meeting began taking their own notes. Local news cameras, initially restricted to the parking lot, had found their way inside, capturing the community's unified stand. Principal Davidson attempted to regain control by proposing a committee to study the issues raised, but the community's patience for committees and studies had run out. They wanted immediate action, concrete steps, and accountability. The meeting concluded not with resolution, but with revolution, a clear message that the status quo could no longer stand. As people filed out of the auditorium, There was a sense that Jefferson High School would never be quite the same. 3 days after the emergency meeting, room 156 buzzed with energy as students gathered for the first meeting of the newly formed Student Diversity and Inclusion Committee. What started as Maya's idea had quickly drawn dozens of interested students, forcing them to relocate from a small classroom to the school library. Sarah worked at the entrance, recording names and contact information on a spreadsheet she created. "That's 47 students so far," she reported to Maya, who stood near the whiteboard, arranging markers by color. "And more keeping coming. We might need a bigger space." The committee represented a cross-section of Jefferson High's student body. Athletes sat next to debate team members, while students who rarely interacted in the hallways now found themselves united in purpose. Many carried notebooks filled with ideas and incidents they wanted to address. Maya took a deep breath before addressing the crowd. The past few days had transformed her from a student who'd been humiliated in front of her class into someone her peers looked to for leadership. "We're not here to complain," she began, her voice stronger than she expected. "We're here to create solutions." Across town, James sat in his home office, surrounded by papers and open laptop screens. He'd taken a week off from his IT consulting job to focus on what he now called the Jefferson Project. His phone buzzed constantly with messages from other parents, community leaders, and even national civil rights organizations interested in their story. Marcus Johnson's preliminary legal analysis had revealed patterns that went beyond Jefferson High, extending into the entire school district. Each new piece of evidence strengthened their case for systematic change. Back at the student meeting, ideas flowed freely. A junior proposed regular cultural awareness events. A freshman suggested revising the dress code to eliminate racial bias. 2 seniors started planning a student-led training program for teachers. "My dad says we need to document everything," Maya explained, writing suggestions on the whiteboard. "Not just what's wrong, but what we want to change and how we plan to do it." James's influence on Maya's approach was clear. She'd watched him organize community actions for years, learning the importance of structure, documentation, and clear objectives. Now she applied those lessons to her own activism. During dinner that evening, father and daughter compared notes. Maya's laptop displayed the student committee's action points while James reviewed community response strategies. Their dining room table had become command central, covered with laptops, papers, and half-eaten takeout containers. "The students get it," Maya explained, showing her father the list of proposed changes. "We're not just asking for sensitivity training or empty promises. We want real representation in school decisions, clear consequences for discrimination, and regular reviews of school policies." James nodded, recognizing his daughter's growing confidence. The incident that could have broken her spirit had instead awakened something stronger. "You're building something important," he said, reviewing her notes. "Something that could help students long after you've graduated." Their shared purpose had deepened their relationship. Maya saw her father not just as a parent, but as a mentor in activism. James discovered that his daughter possessed natural leadership abilities that paralleled his own. The student committee grew rapidly. By the end of the week, they had representatives from every grade level and student group. They organized themselves into subcommittees, each focusing on specific aspects of school culture that needed change. Maya and Sarah spent hours after school developing surveys to gather student experiences. They created secure ways for students to report incidents anonymously, understanding that some might fear retaliation. Their data would support the legal case Marcus was building. The local media took notice. A reporter from the city newspaper interviewed Maya about the student committee's formation. "We're not waiting for adults to fix NGS anymore," she told the reporter. "We're part of the solution." James watched the interview online, feeling pride mixed with concern. He recognized the weight his daughter carried, but also saw how she'd transformed it into purpose. The incident had forced them both to confront institutional racism directly, but instead of breaking them, it had forged them into stronger advocates. As the first week since the incident drew to a close, Maya and James sat in their living room, planning their next steps. The student committee had grown to over 60 members. The community action group had scheduled meetings with district officials. Their individual fights had merged into a unified campaign for change. "Dad," Maya said, looking up from her notebook. "Remember when you used to tell me that sometimes bad things happen so good things can follow?" She gestured to their wall of action plans and committee assignments. "I think I understand that better now." James looked at his daughter, seeing not the hurt student from the coffee incident, but an emerging leader who'd found her voice. Together, they transformed a moment of humiliation into a movement for change, proving that the strongest activism often grows from personal experience. The coffee stains had long since been washed away, but their impact continued to spread through Jefferson High, pushing the school toward necessary change. Maya and James had become partners in a fight larger than themselves, each growing stronger through their shared purpose. Principal Davidson called a press conference in the school gymnasium, flanked by district officials and a hastily assembled diversity task force. The podium displayed a new banner reading "Jefferson High School, Embracing Diversity, Building Unity," its fresh creases betraying how recently it had been printed. Jefferson High School is proud to announce comprehensive new diversity initiatives, Davidson read from a prepared statement. These include mandatory sensitivity training for all staff, a review of disciplinary procedures, and the formation of a diversity oversight committee. In the back of the gymnasium, James and Maya exchanged knowing looks. They received a copy of the new policies that morning. 12 pages of carefully worded promises without concrete deadlines or enforcement mechanisms. "They think this will satisfy us," James whispered to Marcus Johnson, who was taking detailed notes. "Standard playbook. Make enough noise about change to quiet the protests without actually changing anything." The new policies included vague commitments to promote cultural awareness and foster an inclusive environment, but lacked specific measures for accountability. The Oversight Committee would be appointed by the same administration that had ignored previous complaints. Maya's phone buzzed continuously as her student committee members shared their reactions in their group chat. No student representation on the Oversight Committee? Nothing about changing the dress code. They're not even addressing the curriculum issues. After the press conference, James met with core community members in Reverend Marshall's church basement. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as they reviewed the school's proposal line by line. "Look at Section 4, Mrs. Rodriguez pointed out. "They're proposing the same cultural sensitivity training they used 3 years ago, the one that led to zero changes." James stood at a whiteboard, listing the proposal's deficiencies. No student input, no parent oversight, no clear timeline, no consequences for noncompliance. His marker squeaked against the board as the list grew longer. Meanwhile, Maya and Sarah worked with the student committee in the public library's conference room. They brought in poster board, markers, and supplies for their planned peaceful demonstration. "We need to be organized," Maya instructed the group. "Each sign should focus on specific change. As we want, no vague statements, no angry messages. We're not here to fight. We're here to fix things." Students divided into groups, each focusing on different aspects of their demands. Curriculum reform to include diverse perspectives, clear consequences for discriminatory behavior, student representation in policy decisions, regular cultural competency evaluations for staff, revision of dress code and disciplinary policies. The preparation for the protest transformed the library's conference room into a workshop of activism. Students who had never participated in demonstrations before learned about their rights from ACLU pamphlets James had provided. "Remember," Sarah demonstrated, "if counter-protesters show up, we don't engage. We stay focused on our message." She led a practice session on peaceful responses to confrontation. As word of the planned demonstration spread, tension built within the school. Some teachers privately expressed support, while others worried about losing control of their classrooms. The administration sent out emails reminding staff not to discuss the situation with students or media. Ms. Thompson remained conspicuously absent, having taken personal leave. Rumors circulated about whether she would return, but James and Maya stayed focused on systemic changes rather than individual accountability. The local police department contacted James about the planned demonstration. He met with them, ensuring all permits were in order and security measures were discussed. "This isn't about creating conflict," he explained to the police chief. "It's about being heard." Maya spent evenings helping students craft their message. Each poster should tell a story, she explained. Not just what we're against, but what we're for. What does real inclusion look like? What does respect feel like? Support grew beyond the school community. Local businesses offered to provide water and supplies for the demonstrators. Civil rights organizations promised observers to document the event. Local media began running previews of the upcoming demonstration. The administration made last-minute attempts to prevent the demonstration, sending letters to parents warning about disruption to educational activities. Their efforts backfired, drawing more attention to the cause and increasing community support. The night before the planned demonstration, James and Maya sat reviewing their preparations. Maps showed designated areas for protesters, media, and security. Lists detailed responsibilities for student marshals and parent chaperones. Everything was organized to ensure a peaceful but powerful message. "Are you nervous?" James asked his daughter, noticing her checking her phone repeatedly. "Not nervous," Maya replied, looking at the hundreds of supporting messages from students and community members. "Ready." They thought that coffee would silence me. Instead, it gave me a voice. Tomorrow, they'll have to listen. The administration's superficial response had achieved the opposite of its intended effect. Instead of quieting the movement, it had strengthened the community's resolve. The stage was set for a demonstration that would force Jefferson High to confront its issues with more than just empty promises. Dawn broke over Jefferson High School to find the first protesters already assembling. Maya arrived at 6:30 a.m. with Sarah and their core team, carrying boxes of water bottles and first aid kits. Security barriers had been set up overnight, creating clear paths for student access to the building while designating spaces for demonstrators. By 7:15 a.m., the crowd had swelled to several hundred people. Students wearing black armbands with "Change Now" printed in white arrived in groups, many accompanied by parents. The organization was immediately evident. Student marshals in yellow vests directed people to designated areas, while parent volunteers distributed water and instruction sheets for PSEF. All protest. Channel 5 is setting up, Sarah reported, pointing to news vans parking across the street. The Chronicle is here too, and I saw NPR's local reporter. Media presence had grown beyond local coverage. National outlets had picked up the story, framing it within the broader context of educational inequality. James coordinated with police liaison officers, reviewing security protocols one final time. The demonstration permit allowed them to occupy the sidewalks and parking lot until 4 p.m. Student volunteers had already positioned themselves at key points, holding signs with QR codes linking to their documented list of demands and evidence of systematic discrimination. At 7:45 a.m., Maya took her position at the predetermined speaking area. The crowd fell silent as she raised the megaphone. Her voice, clear and steady, carried across the assembled protesters. "We stand here today not because of spilled coffee, but because of years of spilled dreams. We're not here for an apology. We're here for change." From her position near the school's main entrance, Ms. Thompson watched through the window. She hadn't returned to teaching since the incident, claiming medical leave. Her presence today, though hidden, marked her first return to campus. The demonstration grew larger as morning progressed. Students who had initially planned to attend classes joined the protesters instead. The administration's attempt to conduct business as usual faltered as classrooms remained half-empty. Every entrance to the school was flanked by protesters holding signs that told personal stories of discrimination. "My culture is not a dress code violation. Diversity isn't just a word on your website. Education should unite, not divide." At 10 a.m., James took the megaphone for his scheduled speech. The crowd had grown to nearly 1,000 people, including students and supporters from other schools in the district. News helicopters circled overhead, capturing aerial shots of the massive gathering. "Look around you," James began, his voice carrying years of activist experience. "This is what community looks like. This is what change looks like. We're not just parents and students anymore. We're witnesses to history being made." The impact of his words resonated through the crowd, triggering waves of supportive chants. The demonstration had transformed from a school protest into a community movement. Local business owners brought food for the protesters. Civil rights observers documented everything, their presence ensuring that no authority could later minimize the scale of the event. Inside the school, Principal Davidson held emergency meetings with district officials. The size and organization of the protest had caught them off guard. Their prepared statements about maintaining educational order seemed inadequate against the powerful display of unity outside their windows. By noon, the demonstration had garnered national social media attention. #JeffersonJustice trended nationwide, with supporters sharing similar stories from schools across the country. Maya's student committee maintained real-time updates on their social media channels, ensuring their message stayed clear and focused. Ms. Thompson finally emerged from the building at 1 p.m., escorted by her union representative. The crowd parted silently as she walked to her car, their silence more powerful than any shouts could have been. Some students raised their signs higher, ensuring she could read their messages about systematic change. The afternoon brought more supporters, including state legislators and civil rights leaders who had traveled to show solidarity. Each new arrival added weight to the demonstration's message. This wasn't just about one incident or one school, but about fundamental change in educational equality. At 3 p.m., Maya and James led the assembled protesters in a synchronized moment of silence. For 5 minutes, the only sound was the wind, indeed distant traffic. The silence spoke volumes about their discipline and determination. As the permitted time drew to a close at 4 p.m., Maya took the megaphone one final time. The crowd had maintained its size and energy throughout the day, defying expectations of dwindling numbers. "Today we showed them our strength," she declared. "Tomorrow we show them our dedication. This isn't a one-day event. This is the beginning of real change." The demonstration dispersed as organized as it had assembled. Student volunteers collected trash, ensuring they left no trace of their presence except the undeniable impact of their message. The media continued their coverage as protesters departed, interviewing participants about the day's significance. James and Maya stayed until the last protester left, overseeing cleanup and security. They had achieved something remarkable, a massive demonstration that remained peaceful while delivering an unmistakable message. The administration could no longer dismiss their demands as the complaints of a vocal minority. That evening, news coverage showed aerial shots of the demonstration, estimating final attendance at over 1,500 people. The story had evolved from a local incident to a national conversation about discrimination in education. Jefferson High School had become a symbol of both systematic problems and organized resistance. The morning after the demonstration, Jefferson High School found itself at the center of a media storm. National news networks ran footage of the protest during their morning broadcasts, while major newspapers featured photos of Maya and James on their front pages. The student committee's social media accounts gained thousands of followers overnight. Inside the school's administrative offices, staff struggled to manage the flood of incoming calls. Education reporters from across the country requested comments, while civil rights organizations demanded access to school records. Principal Davidson's secretary had filled 3 notepads with message callbacks before 9 a.m. "CNN is on line 1, she reported wearily. The Washington Post on line 2, and the Department of Education's Civil Rights Division is holding on line 3. The media coverage focused not just on the demonstration itself, but on the broader implications. News analysts praised the protesters' organization and peaceful approach while highlighting the systematic issues they'd exposed. Archived footage of previous incidents at Jefferson High began circulating online, supporting the community's claims of long-term discrimination. Sarah managed the student committee's response from the library's media center, where they'd set up an impromptu press office. "Every major education blog wants to interview us," she told Maya, scrolling through hundreds of email requests. "And we're trending on 3 different social platforms." The committee worked systematically, documenting every media mention and archiving all coverage. They understood that maintaining momentum required careful management of their message. Student volunteers monitored comment sections and social media, collecting supportive statements while documenting any attempts to minimize their concerns. Local businesses began pulling their sponsorship from school events, pressuring the administration through financial means. The annual business partnership breakfast, usually a major fundraising event, saw half its regular participants withdraw. "We cannot maintain association with an institution that fails to address discrimination," wrote the CEO of a major local employer in a public statement. "Our company values demand more than superficial responses to serious issues." The school board announced an emergency session to address the situation. News crews set up early outside the district offices, capturing footage of board members arriving through side entrances to avoid questions. Inside, Marcus Johnson presented a detailed legal analysis of the school's vulnerability to civil rights litigation. Maya and her student committee representatives attended the session, occupying the front row with notebooks and tablets ready. They'd prepared detailed responses to every possible administrative argument, backed by documented incidents and statistical analysis. "The students aren't just protesting," Marcus explained to the board. "They're building a legal case. Every incident is documented. Every response is recorded. The liability grows daily." National civil rights organizations began offering support. The ACLU assigned a team to review the case. The NAACP's Education Division requested meetings with student leaders. What started as a local protest had evolved into a potential landmark case for educational equity. Media attention turned to Ms. Thompson's history at the school. Reporters uncovered previous incidents that had been quietly resolved, including complaints from former students that matched current allegations. Her continued absence from campus spoke volumes, though her union representatives maintained she was on medical leave. The pressure extended beyond Jefferson High. Other schools in the district faced increased scrutiny as similar patterns emerged. Parents at neighboring schools began forming their own committees, using Maya's group as a model for organizing their concerns. Sarah coordinated with these emerging groups, sharing their organizational framework and documentation methods. "We're creating a network," she explained during a committee meeting. "Every new group strengthens our position." By week's end, national education organizations had picked up the story. Academic journals requested interviews about the student-led movement. Graduate students in education programs began citing the Jefferson High situation in their research papers. The media coverage forced the school board to acknowledge the scope of the problem. Their usual strategy of waiting for public interest to fade proved ineffective against the organized pressure from students, parents, and now the national press. "The story isn't going away," James told reporters outside the district offices. "Every day they delay real change. More evidence emerges. More students speak up. More parents join the cause." Maya found herself juggling interview requests while maintaining her leadership role. News profiles painted her as the face of a new generation of student activists, highlighting how she transformed a personal incident into a movement for systematic change. The sustained media attention created an unexpected advantage: transparency. With reporters watching every move, the administration could no longer handle complaints quietly or dismiss concerns without response. Every action, or lack thereof, became part of the public record. As the week drew to a close, national education experts began arriving in town, drawn by the story's implications for broader policy discussions. They saw in Jefferson High a microcosm of challenges facing schools nationwide, and in Maya's movement a potential model for addressing these issues. The media spotlight had achieved what years of individual complaints could not. It had made the problems at Jefferson High impossible to ignore. The administration faced a choice: implement real change or become a cautionary tale in educational equity cases across the country. The television studio's green room buzzed with pre-interview activity. James adjusted his tie, while a makeup artist applied finishing touches. Producer assistants rushed about with clipboards, checking sound levels and lighting. This wasn't local news anymore. James was about to appear on a national morning show. 5 minutes, Mr. Williams, a production assistant called out. Through the monitor, James could see the host discussing the Jefferson High situation with their panel of education experts. Graphics displayed statistics his daughter's committee had compiled: racial disparities in disciplinary actions, demographic differences in advanced placement enrollment, patterns in teacher recommendations. The interview began with the expected questions about the coffee incident. But James quickly steered the conversation toward deeper issues. What happened to Maya was a spark, he explained, his voice steady and measured. But the kindling had been gathering for years. He proceeded to outline systematic problems they'd uncovered. Minority students receiving disproportionate disciplinary actions. Cultural celebrations relegated to after-school activities while traditional events occupied prime school hours. Subtle discouragements from advanced placement courses. Dress code enforcement that disproportionately targeted certain cultural expressions. College recommendation letters that showed concerning patterns in language and emphasis. The host leaned forward, clearly engaged. You're describing something more than isolated incidents. We've documented over 200 specific instances of bias in the past 3 years alone, James responded, pulling out a thick folder. Each one dismissed as a misunderstanding, an isolated incident, or an oversensitive reaction. But patterns don't lie. Back at Jefferson High, students gathered in the cafeteria to watch the interview on projected screens. The administration had attempted to ban viewing during school hours, but teachers quietly defied the directive, recognizing the educational value of the moment. James revealed new information during the interview, including internal emails obtained through public records requests. These communications showed administrators discussing ways to minimize diversity complaints rather than address their root causes. Look at this email chain, James said, holding up printed copies. Administrators discussing how to manage parent expectations rather than fix actual problems. They spent more time crafting responses than creating solutions. The interview's impact was immediate. Within hours, the district superintendent's office announced an independent investigation into Jefferson High's practices. Civil rights organizations cited James's revelations in their calls for broader educational reform. Maya watched the interview from home, taking notes for the student committee. Her father's composed delivery and thorough documentation represented everything she'd learned about effective advocacy. Each point he made connected to evidence they'd gathered, each accusation supported by documented incidents. The reporter pressed James about Ms. Thompson's role. His response showed the movement's broader focus. This isn't about one teacher or one incident. The coffee spill was merely visible evidence of invisible barriers our children face every day. District officials scrambled to respond as James revealed more troubling patterns. Funding disparities between cultural programs, inconsistent application of academic support services, selective enforcement of school policies, documented cases of cultural insensitivity in curriculum choices, evidence of bias in extracurricular activity selections. Social media exploded with each new revelation. Parents from other schools began sharing similar experiences, creating a cascade of evidence that pointed to district-wide issues. The hashtag more than coffee started trending nationally. As the interview concluded, James delivered his most powerful statement. We're not asking for special treatment. We're demanding equal respect, equal opportunity, and equal consideration. Our children deserve an education free from bias, whether that bias is obvious or subtle. The television appearance triggered a new wave of media interest. Reporters began investigating other schools in the district, uncovering similar patterns. What started as one school's problem had exposed systematic issues throughout the educational system. Mark S. Johnson's phone rang constantly as other civil rights attorneys reached out to coordinate efforts. The case was evolving from a local dispute into a potential class action lawsuit that could affect educational policy nationwide. By afternoon, national education advocacy groups had issued statements supporting James's claims. Educational policy experts began citing Jefferson High as a case study in how subtle discrimination persists in modern schools. The interview's impact reached beyond education circles. Local political leaders, sensing the shifting public sentiment, began calling for oversight committees and policy reviews. Corporate donors threatened to withhold funding until meaningful changes were implemented. James returned home that evening to find his email inbox overwhelmed with messages from parents across the country sharing similar stories. What had begun as a father defending his daughter had evolved into a movement that gave voice to thousands of similar experiences. Maya organized an emergency meeting of the student committee to discuss the new developments. They needed to prepare for increased scrutiny while maintaining focus on their original goals. The national attention brought both opportunities and challenges. Dad didn't just tell our story today, Maya told the committee. He showed everyone that what happened here isn't unique. Now we have to prove we're ready to lead the change we've been demanding. The emergency school board meeting convened in the district's largest auditorium, yet still couldn't accommodate everyone who wanted to attend. Screens were set up in overflow rooms, and the proceedings were live-streamed for the thousands watching from home. The revelation about Ms. Thompson's background had turned a tense situation explosive. Marcus Johnson stood at the podium, methodically presenting evidence that Ms. Thompson hadn't simply been a teacher who made a mistake. Documents obtained through legal discovery revealed a history of discriminatory behavior at 3 previous schools, each incident carefully buried under confidential settlements and quiet transfers. The coffee incident wasn't an accident, Marcus declared, his voice steady as he displayed employment records on the projection screen. It was the visible manifestation of a pattern of behavior that this district repeatedly chose to ignore. The evidence was damning. Sealed complaints from her previous positions, internal emails discussing concerns about her classroom conduct, documentation of selective enforcement of rules against minority students, performance reviews that hinted at problems but never addressed them directly, transfer papers that moved her between schools without addressing underlying issues. Principal Davidson sat ashen-faced as Marcus revealed how the administration had known about Ms. Thompson's history when they hired her. The decision to bring her on despite documented concerns represented a systemic failure that could no longer be ignored. In the audience, James and Maya sat together, watching years of institutional negligence come to light. The coffee incident that had sparked their movement now appeared as just one point in a long line of administrative failures. We have documented evidence, Marcus continued, of 17 separate incidents involving Ms. Thompson at Jefferson High alone. Each was reported. Each was dismissed. Each reinforced a culture of discrimination that the administration chose to perpetuate. The board members shifted uncomfortably as Marcus presented statements from former students, each describing similar experiences of discrimination. The pattern stretched back years, crossing district lines and affecting hundreds of students. A former administrator from one of Ms. Thompson's previous schools had come forward, breaking years of silence to describe how complaints against her were systematically buried to avoid controversy. His testimony, displayed on the screens, painted a picture of institutional complicity in ongoing discrimination. The revelation transformed the narrative. What had begun as a protest against one incident had exposed decades of systematic failure across multiple institutions. The implications reached far beyond Jefferson High, threatening to upend administrative practices throughout the district. Maya's student committee presented their findings next, demonstrating how Ms. Thompson's actions fit into broader patterns of institutional bias. Their meticulous documentation showed correlations between teacher attitudes and student outcomes, putting hard data behind long-suspected disparities. The board's attempt to contain the damage through traditional means, promises of investigation, offers of sensitivity training, crumbled in the face of overwhelming evidence. This wasn't just about one teacher or one incident. It was about a system that had failed its fundamental responsibility to protect and serve all students equally. As pressure mounted, the board announced its decision. Ms. Thompson's employment was terminated, but more importantly, sweeping changes were mandated across the district. Independent oversight of hiring practices, mandatory review of past discrimination complaints, new protocols for responding to reports of bias, student and parent representation on policy committees, regular external audits of disciplinary actions and academic recommendations, comprehensive revision of cultural competency requirements. The victory felt bittersweet. While the changes represented everything they'd fought for, the revealed scope of discrimination left a deep impact on the community. Students who'd faced similar treatment over the years came forward, their stories finally finding validation. James addressed the media afterwards, standing with Maya and the student committee. "Today isn't about punishment," he declared. "It's about acknowledgement and change. We've exposed the truth, not to destroy, but to rebuild, to create an educational system that truly serves all students." Maya's committee transformed into a permanent student advocacy group, with chapters forming in schools across the district. Their model of organized resistance and documented advocacy became a template for student activists nationwide. The incident that began with spilled coffee had cracked open decades of institutional failure, forcing uncomfortable but necessary changes. Jefferson High would never be the same, and neither would the hundreds of schools watching and learning from their experience. As James and Maya left the meeting, they passed the empty classroom where everything had started. The coffee stains had long since been cleaned away, but their impact had permanently altered the landscape of their educational system. "You know what, Dad?" Maya said, pausing in the doorway. "When I was working on that diversity presentation, I wanted to show how small changes could make a difference. I never imagined we'd end up making such big ones." James looked at his daughter, seeing not the victim of discrimination, but a leader who had helped transform tragedy into triumph. "Sometimes," he replied, "it takes a small moment to reveal big truths. What matters is what we do with them." The coffee incident would be remembered not for the hurt it caused, but for the change it inspired. In exposing one teacher's bias, they had revealed and begun to dismantle systems of discrimination that had persisted for generations. It wasn't just justice for Maya, it was transformation for an entire community.